Marcus Wellington stepped out of his black Bentley, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath his Italian leather shoes bringing back memories he had buried for 8 years. The mansion stood before him like a monument to his past life, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. He had built this empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation that now dominated 3 continents. But success had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. The house looked exactly as he remembered it, yet everything felt different. The manicured lawn stretched endlessly, maintained by a team of gardeners who ensured every blade of grass was perfect. Rose bushes lined the circular driveway, their red blooms a stark contrast against the pristine white facade. This had been his sanctuary once, the place where he thought he would raise his family and grow old with the woman he loved. His wife Victoria had insisted on this separation 8 years ago. Their marriage had crumbled under the weight of his ambition and her growing resentment. She claimed he cared more about his business deals than his family, more about his reputation than his relationships. The divorce had been brutal, fought in courtrooms and splashed across tabloid headlines. Victoria had won custody of their twin children, Emma and James, who were barely 2 years old at the time. Marcus had thrown himself into his work after the divorce, expanding his business empire across Asia and Europe. Every sleepless night, every missed meal, every canceled vacation had been justified by the growing numbers in his bank account. He told himself he was building something for his children, a legacy they could inherit. But deep down, he knew he was running from the pain of losing them. The court had granted him limited visitation rights, but Victoria had made it clear that his presence was unwelcome. Every attempt to see his children had been met with lawyers' letters and restraining orders. She painted him as an absent father who cared only about money, a narrative that the media eagerly embraced. Eventually he stopped trying, convincing himself that his children were better off without him. Now at 45, Marcus was returning to claim what was rightfully his. Victoria had died in a car accident 3 weeks ago, a tragedy that had shocked him to his core despite their bitter history. The funeral had been a private affair, attended by Victoria's friends and family who still viewed him as the villain in their love story. He had stood at the back of the church, watching strangers comfort his children while he remained an outsider in their grief. The house keys felt heavy in his pocket as he approached the front door. According to his lawyer, Victoria had left everything to the children, with Marcus named as their guardian in her will. It was an ironic twist of fate that the woman who had fought so hard to keep him away from his children had ultimately entrusted him with their care. Perhaps she had finally realized that despite his flaws, he was still their father. Marcus paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Through the tall windows he could see movement inside. His children were now 10 years old, practically strangers to him. They had grown up hearing stories about their father from Victoria's perspective, stories that likely painted him as a monster who abandoned them for money and power. How could he possibly bridge that gap? The door opened before he could ring the bell, revealing a woman he had almost forgotten. Grace Moreau stood in the doorway, her dark skin glowing with health, her eyes as kind as he remembered them. She had been their housekeeper when he and Victoria were married, a quiet presence who had managed their household with efficiency and warmth. She was perhaps 35 now, still beautiful in a natural way that reminded him of simpler times. Grace's expression was unreadable as she looked at him. She wore a simple blue dress and an apron, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Behind her, he could hear the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house. His children's laughter. The sound hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of everything he had missed. The silence stretched between them, filled with 8 years of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Grace had witnessed the breakdown of his marriage, had seen him at his worst during those final months before the divorce. She had been there when Victoria had screamed at him to leave, when he had packed his bags in the middle of the night rather than face another confrontation. What must she think of him now, returning like a ghost from the past? Finally, Grace stepped aside, allowing him to enter his former home. The interior was exactly as Victoria had left it, a museum of their shared past. Family photos lined the hallway, but Marcus noticed that his face had been carefully cropped out of most of them. It was as if Victoria had tried to erase him from their family history, to pretend that he had never existed at all. As they walked through the house, Grace remained silent, leading him toward the sound of the children's voices. Marcus felt his heart racing with anticipation and fear. What would he say to them? How could he explain 8 years of absence? How could he tell them that he had never stopped loving them, even when it seemed like he had forgotten they existed? The weight of his return pressed down on him like a physical burden. He was about to face the consequences of choices he had made years ago, choices that had cost him the most precious things in his life. But he was also about to discover secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family. Secrets that Grace had been keeping hidden in the shadows of his former home. Grace led Marcus through the familiar hallways of his former home, her footsteps silent on the marble floors. The house felt like a time capsule, preserving memories he had tried so hard to forget. Expensive artwork still hung on the walls, pieces he and Victoria had collected during their happier years. The Persian rugs beneath their feet had been wedding gifts, symbols of a future that had crumbled into bitter legal battles and accusations. They reached the living room where 2 children sat on the carpet, surrounded by textbooks and papers. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he saw them for the first time in 8 years. Emma had grown into a beautiful girl with Victoria's blonde hair and delicate features, but her eyes held a sharpness that reminded him of himself. James was taller than his sister, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated on his homework. They both looked up when Grace and Marcus entered the room. The children's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Emma's face hardened with recognition, while James simply stared with curious eyes. Marcus realized that they knew exactly who he was despite the years of separation. Victoria must have shown them pictures, told them stories, prepared them for this moment in ways he could never have imagined. Emma was the first to speak, her voice cold and mature beyond her 10 years. She asked why he had come back, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. There was no warmth in her tone, no recognition of their biological connection. To her, he was simply the man who had abandoned them, the father who had chosen money over family. Marcus struggled to find words that could bridge 8 years of absence and resentment. Grace stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. She spoke softly to both children, reminding them of the conversation they had shared earlier about their father's return. Marcus watched in amazement as both children immediately relaxed at Grace's touch, their defensive postures softening. It was clear that Grace held a special place in their hearts, a position of trust and authority that Victoria had never granted to him. James asked if Marcus was really their father, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than Emma's hostility. Marcus knelt down to their level, trying to appear less intimidating in his expensive suit. He confirmed that he was indeed their father, that he had missed them every single day since the divorce. But even as he spoke, he could see the skepticism in Emma's eyes, the doubt that had been carefully cultivated over years of his absence. The conversation was awkward and stilted, filled with the weight of unspoken accusations and missed opportunities. Marcus tried to ask about their interests, their school, their friends, but every question felt like an intrusion. These children were strangers to him, and he was a stranger to them. The biological connection that should have bridged the gap felt meaningless in the face of 8 years of separation. Grace watched the interaction with careful eyes, intervening whenever the conversation threatened to become too emotional. She suggested that Marcus might like to see the rest of the house to reacquaint himself with his former home. The children returned to their homework with obvious relief, grateful for an excuse to escape the uncomfortable reunion. As they walked through the house, Marcus began to notice things that puzzled him. The children's bedrooms were beautifully decorated and meticulously maintained, but there were details that didn't match Victoria's usual style. Emma's room had a collection of books about astronomy and space exploration, interests that Victoria had never encouraged. James's room was filled with musical instruments and sheet music, despite Victoria's general disdain for anything she considered impractical. Grace explained that she had been helping the children explore their interests, encouraging them to pursue hobbies and passions that brought them joy. Marcus was grateful but also confused. Why would Victoria allow the housekeeper such influence over the children's upbringing? His ex-wife had always been controlling about every aspect of their home life, from the color of the curtains to the brand of breakfast cereal. The kitchen held even more surprises. Grace moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had complete authority over the household. The refrigerator was covered with the children's artwork and school achievements, but also with photos that made Marcus pause. There were pictures of Grace with the children at various events and locations, captured moments of joy and laughter that spoke of genuine family bonds. In one photo, Grace was teaching Emma to braid her hair, both of them laughing at something off camera. Another showed James and Grace building a treehouse in the backyard, both covered in sawdust and grinning with pride. These were intimate family moments, the kind of memories that Marcus had always imagined sharing with his children. Instead, Grace had been there for every milestone, every achievement, every moment of childhood wonder. Marcus began to realize that Grace's role in the household extended far beyond that of a typical employee. She had become a surrogate parent to his children, filling the void left by his absence and Victoria's emotional distance. The children clearly adored her, turning to her for comfort and guidance in ways they had never turned to him. She knew their favorite foods, their bedtime routines, their fears and dreams. The dining room table was set for dinner, and Marcus noticed that 4 places had been prepared. Grace had assumed he would be staying for the meal, despite not asking his intentions. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of a thoughtfulness that touched him deeply. She was trying to create a bridge between him and his children, even though she had every reason to resent his sudden reappearance in their lives. As evening approached, Marcus found himself watching Grace interact with Emma and James. She helped Emma with a difficult math problem, patiently explaining the concepts until the girl's face lit up with understanding. She listened to James practice piano, offering gentle corrections and praise that made the boy beam with pride. These were the parental moments that Marcus had missed, the daily interactions that build lasting bonds between adults and children. The weight of his realization began to settle on Marcus like a heavy blanket. Grace had not just been caring for his children in his absence. She had been raising them. She had been their constant source of love, support, and guidance through their most formative years. While he had been building his business empire, she had been building relationships with his children that ran deeper than blood, stronger than legal documents, more meaningful than all his wealth combined. Dinner was a revelation that shook Marcus to his core. As Grace served the meal, he observed the seamless family dynamic that had developed in his absence. The children chattered naturally with Grace about their day at school, sharing details about friends, teachers, and upcoming events. They asked her opinion on everything from homework assignments to weekend plans, treating her words with the respect typically reserved for a beloved parent. Emma told Grace about a science project she was working on, her eyes lighting up as she described her plans to build a model solar system. Grace listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged Emma to think deeper about the concepts she was learning. Marcus tried to join the conversation, offering to help with resources or materials, but Emma's enthusiasm dimmed noticeably when he spoke. She responded politely but briefly, clearly more interested in Grace's input than his. James was equally devoted to Grace, seeking her approval for a song he had been practicing for the school talent show. She promised to help him rehearse later, suggesting techniques that would improve his performance. When Marcus offered to arrange for professional music lessons, James looked to Grace for guidance before responding. It was as if Marcus's approval meant nothing compared to Grace's opinion. The meal itself was another surprise. Grace had prepared all the children's favorite dishes, foods that Marcus didn't even remember them liking. She knew that Emma preferred her vegetables cooked until crispy, that James would only eat chicken if it was seasoned with specific herbs. These were intimate details of daily life, the small preferences that parents typically know by heart. Marcus felt like a stranger at his own table, watching a family unit that had formed without him. After dinner, Grace began the evening routine with practiced efficiency. She reminded Emma about her upcoming book report, helping her choose between several novels she had already read. She checked James's backpack for completed homework, signing a permission slip for a field trip with the casual authority of a legal guardian. Marcus watched in amazement as she navigated these parental responsibilities with complete confidence. When it came time for the children to go to bed, Marcus expected them to say goodnight to Grace and head upstairs independently. Instead, he witnessed something that left him speechless. Grace walked Emma to her room, helping her choose pajamas and listening patiently as the girl recounted every detail of her friend's birthday party from the previous weekend. She braided Emma's hair for bed, a nightly ritual that clearly brought them both comfort. With James, Grace's role was equally maternal. She sat on his bed while he practiced reading aloud from a chapter book, gently correcting his pronunciation and praising his improvement. She tucked him in with the kind of tender care that spoke of years of bedtime stories and goodnight kisses. James asked if she would be there when he woke up, seeking the reassurance that had apparently become routine in their household. Marcus followed Grace downstairs after the children were settled, his mind reeling with questions and emotions he couldn't fully process. The living room felt different now, less like a showplace and more like a genuine family home. Children's books were stacked on the coffee table, board games occupied one corner, and family photos showed Grace included in nearly every significant moment of the past 8 years. Grace began cleaning up from dinner, moving through the tasks with the efficiency of someone who had been managing this household for years. Marcus offered to help, but she politely declined, explaining that she had her own system and preferred to handle things herself. The message was clear. This was her domain, her responsibility, her family to care for. As they worked in the kitchen, Marcus finally asked the question that had been building inside him all evening. He wanted to know how long Grace had been living in the house, whether she had always been so involved in the children's daily care. Her answer stunned him. Grace had moved into the guest house on the property shortly after his divorce, taking on increasing responsibility for Emma and James as Victoria became more focused on her social activities and charitable commitments. Victoria had apparently struggled with single motherhood more than Marcus had realized. According to Grace, his ex-wife had found the daily demands of parenting overwhelming, especially as she tried to rebuild her social life after the divorce. Grace had gradually taken over more and more of the children's care, from helping with homework to attending parent-teacher conferences to organizing birthday parties and playdates. Marcus learned that Grace had been the one to teach Emma to ride a bicycle, to comfort James through his first day of school anxiety, to celebrate their achievements and console them through their disappointments. She had been their constant, their anchor, their source of unconditional love and support. While Victoria had provided material comfort, and Marcus had provided financial support from a distance, Grace had provided the emotional nurturing that children desperately need. The revelation explained so much about the children's behavior toward him. They weren't just resentful about his absence. They were protective of the woman who had truly raised them. Grace wasn't just their housekeeper or nanny. She was their primary parent figure, the person they turned to for guidance, comfort, and love. His return threatened to disrupt a family structure that had been working beautifully without him. Grace's own background added another layer to Marcus's understanding. She had come to work for them when she was in her 20s, a young woman from a modest background who had needed the job to support her own education. She had never married, had no children of her own, and had poured all her maternal instincts into caring for Emma and James. They had become her family just as surely as she had become theirs. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself seeing his situation from an entirely different perspective. He had returned expecting to reclaim his children, to step back into a father role that he had legally maintained but practically abandoned. Instead, he had discovered that his children already had a parent who loved them, understood them, and had sacrificed her own life to ensure their happiness and well-being. The question that haunted him now was whether his presence would help or harm the beautiful family dynamic that had developed in his absence. Could he find a place in this household without disrupting the bonds that Grace had so carefully nurtured? Or would his return destroy the only stable family structure his children had ever known? The next morning brought revelations that would shake the foundation of everything Marcus thought he knew about his family. He woke early in what had once been his home office, now converted into a guest room that Grace had prepared for him. Through the window, he could see the guest house where Grace lived, a small but elegant structure that Victoria had originally planned as an artist's studio, but had never used. Marcus decided to explore the house more thoroughly, hoping to understand the life his children had been living without him. In Victoria's former bedroom, now clearly Grace's domain based on the personal items scattered about, he found a collection of photo albums that told the story of his children's lives in vivid detail. Every birthday, every school play, every lost tooth, every proud moment had been carefully documented by Grace's camera. The photos revealed a truth that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Grace wasn't just caring for his children, she was completely devoted to them in a way that transcended any professional relationship. In picture after picture, Marcus could see the genuine love and pride in Grace's eyes as she watched Emma and James grow and develop. These weren't the posed, formal family portraits that Victoria had favored, but candid moments of real family life. One album was particularly revealing. It contained photos from what appeared to be a family vacation to the beach, taken about 3 years earlier. Grace was building sandcastles with both children, teaching them to surf, reading to them under a beach umbrella. Victoria was notably absent from most of the photos, appearing only in a few formal shots where she looked more like a reluctant participant than an engaged mother. Marcus found receipts and documents that painted an even clearer picture of Grace's role in the family. She had been paying for the children's music lessons, their sports equipment, their school supplies. Her modest salary as a housekeeper couldn't possibly have covered these expenses, which meant she had been using her own savings to provide for Emma and James. The financial sacrifices she had made for his children's well-being humbled him completely. In Grace's desk drawer, Marcus discovered something that stopped him cold. There were letters addressed to him, dozens of them, written over the past 8 years, but never sent. With trembling hands, he opened the first one, dated just 6 months after his divorce. Grace had written about Emma's first day of kindergarten, describing how the little girl had cried for her daddy and asked why he didn't come to see her anymore. Each letter was a window into moments he had missed, milestones he hadn't celebrated, struggles he hadn't helped resolve. Grace had written about James's first piano recital, about Emma's broken arm from falling off her bicycle, about their questions about why their father had left them. The letters revealed Grace's own struggle to explain his absence to children, who desperately wanted to understand why their daddy didn't love them enough to stay. What struck Marcus most powerfully was the tone of the letters. Grace never criticized him directly, never called him selfish or cruel despite having every right to do so. Instead, she wrote about the children's needs, their achievements, their growth. She had been trying to keep him connected to their lives even when he had made no effort to maintain that connection himself. She had been preserving their relationship with him even when he had abandoned it completely. The most recent letters revealed an even deeper truth. Grace had been preparing Emma and James for his return long before Victoria's death. She had been talking to them about forgiveness, about the complexity of adult relationships, about the possibility that their father might one day want to be part of their lives again. She had been building bridges that Marcus hadn't even known existed. As Marcus sat reading these letters in Grace's private space, he began to understand the full scope of her sacrifice. She had given up her own dreams of marriage and family to raise his children. She had loved them completely without reservation, asking for nothing in return except the joy of watching them grow into remarkable human beings. She had been more of a parent to them than either he or Victoria had ever been. The sound of children's laughter from the kitchen drew Marcus downstairs, where he found Grace making pancakes, while Emma and James helped prepare fruit toppings. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so naturally loving, that Marcus felt like an intruder in his own home. Grace looked up when he entered, offering him coffee with the same gracious hospitality she might show any guest. During breakfast, Marcus watched the easy communication between Grace and the children. They discussed plans for the weekend, with Grace carefully balancing their desires for fun activities with practical concerns about homework and chores. She knew exactly how to motivate them, when to be firm and when to be flexible. Her parenting style was intuitive and effective, born from years of deep understanding of their individual personalities. Emma mentioned a friend's invitation to a sleepover party, looking to Grace for permission. When Grace asked about homework responsibilities and confirmed the other parent's supervision, Marcus realized he had no idea what questions to ask or what concerns to raise. Grace navigated these parenting decisions with wisdom gained through experience, while Marcus felt completely out of his depth. James asked Grace about trying out for the school soccer team, seeking her advice about balancing sports with his music lessons. Again, Grace demonstrated intimate knowledge of his strengths, his schedule, and his long-term interests. She encouraged him to pursue both activities while helping him think through the practical challenges. Marcus wanted to contribute to the conversation, but realized he knew nothing about his son's athletic abilities or time commitments. After breakfast, as Grace began organizing the children for their Saturday activities, Marcus found himself confronting the harsh reality of his situation. He had legal custody of Emma and James, but Grace had their hearts. He could provide them with material advantages and financial security, but Grace had given them something far more valuable: consistent, unconditional love and devoted attention to their individual needs and dreams. The children's attachment to Grace went beyond simple affection. It was the deep, unshakable bond that forms between children and their primary caregiver. She wasn't just someone they loved. She was their emotional anchor, their source of security, their guide through the complexities of growing up. Removing her from their lives would be devastating. But figuring out how to include her in his new role as their guardian would require wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed. As Marcus watched Grace braid Emma's hair before their departure for a friend's birthday party, he realized that his homecoming had revealed a truth more complex than he had ever imagined. His children didn't need him to rescue them from a difficult situation. They needed him to recognize and preserve the beautiful family structure that Grace had created in his absence. The afternoon brought a confrontation that Marcus had been dreading, but knew was inevitable. After the children left for their various activities, he and Grace found themselves alone in the house for the first time since his return. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and 8 years of complicated history. Marcus knew he needed to address the elephant in the room. What would happen now that he was back? Grace was folding laundry in the living room when Marcus approached her, her movements efficient and graceful as always. She had changed from her morning clothes into casual jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more relaxed than she had the day before. Marcus struggled to find the right words to begin a conversation that would determine the future of everyone involved. He started by thanking her for everything she had done for Emma and James, recognizing that his words were inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude. Grace listened quietly, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts or emotions. When he finished speaking, she simply nodded and continued, folding the children's clothes. With the same careful attention she gave to every aspect of their care, Marcus then asked the question that had been consuming him since his arrival. He wanted to know what Grace thought should happen now, how they should structure their household to best serve the children's needs. Her answer revealed a wisdom and selflessness that humbled him completely. She said that her primary concern was Emma and James's happiness and stability, that any decisions about the future should be based on what was best for them. Grace explained that she had always known this day might come, that Victoria's death had made his return inevitable. She had been preparing herself emotionally for the possibility that her role in the children's lives might change dramatically. What she wanted most was assurance that Emma and James would be allowed to maintain the relationships and routines that had given their lives structure and meaning. The conversation revealed Grace's deep understanding of child psychology and development. She spoke about the importance of consistency for children who had already experienced significant loss and disruption. She worried about how Marcus's sudden presence might affect their sense of security, especially since they had no real relationship with him to build upon. Marcus found himself asking Grace to stay, to continue caring for the children as she always had, but now with his support and involvement. He offered her a substantial increase in salary, better living arrangements, whatever she needed to make the situation work for everyone. But Grace's response surprised him. She wasn't concerned about money or material benefits. She was worried about the emotional complexities of the new arrangement. Grace pointed out that Marcus's return created an awkward situation for everyone involved. The children saw her as their primary parent figure, while the law recognized him as their legal guardian. How would they navigate decisions about discipline, education, social activities, and the countless other choices that parents make daily? Who would have final authority when they disagreed about what was best for Emma and James? Her concerns were practical and well-founded. Marcus realized that he had been so focused on reclaiming his children that he hadn't considered the complex logistics of blending into an established family unit. Grace had been making parental decisions independently for years, guided by intimate knowledge of the children's personalities and needs. Could she continue to parent effectively if she had to defer to his authority on major decisions? The conversation took an even more serious turn when Grace revealed her biggest fear: She was terrified that Marcus would eventually decide that her presence was unnecessary or inappropriate, that he would want to establish his own relationship with the children without her influence. She had seen wealthy parents fire long-term caregivers once they no longer needed their services, and she couldn't bear the thought of being separated from Emma and James after raising them from toddlers. Marcus was shocked by Grace's vulnerability, by the pain in her voice when she spoke about potentially losing the children she clearly considered her own. He began to understand that Grace's devotion to Emma and James wasn't just professional dedication. It was the deepest kind of parental love, formed through years of daily care, sacrifice, and emotional investment. Grace then shared something that explained everything about her commitment to his children. She told Marcus that she had suffered a miscarriage early in her 20s, losing the child she had desperately wanted with a man who had subsequently abandoned her. The loss had devastated her, making her believe that she would never have the family she had always dreamed of having. Emma and James had filled that void in her life, becoming the children she had never been able to bear. The revelation recontextualized everything Marcus had observed about Grace's relationship with his children. Her love for them wasn't just professional care or even surrogate parenting. It was the fierce protective love of a woman who had found her purpose in nurturing and raising them. They were her children in every way that mattered except biology, and the thought of losing them was her greatest nightmare. Marcus found himself making a promise that surprised even him. He told Grace that he had no intention of disrupting the family she had created, that his goal was to find his place within it rather than to replace her role. He recognized that Emma and James needed Grace more than they needed him, and that any successful co-parenting arrangement would require her continued involvement as their primary caregiver. But Grace's next question challenged Marcus to examine his own motivations more deeply. She asked whether he was prepared to be a real father to Emma and James, to invest the time and emotional energy that parenting required. She had seen too many wealthy parents who believed that providing money and occasional attention was sufficient, who never truly connected with their children on an emotional level. Grace wanted assurance that Marcus understood what being a parent really meant, showing up for school plays and soccer games, helping with homework and friendship drama, being present for both the joyful moments and the difficult ones. She had been doing these things alone for years, and she needed to know that Marcus was committed to being a true partner in raising their children, not just a financial provider who lived in the same house. The intensity of their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children returning home, their voices echoing through the house as they called for Grace. Marcus watched as both Emma and James immediately sought her out, eager to share the details of their afternoon activities. They barely acknowledged his presence, too excited about telling Grace about their adventures to notice their father standing nearby. In that moment, Marcus realized that earning his children's love and trust would require more than legal custody or good intentions. It would require him to prove that he was worthy of the family that Grace had so lovingly created and protected in his absence. The following weeks tested everyone's patience and resolve as they struggled to establish a new family dynamic. Marcus had moved back into the master bedroom, a decision that felt both natural and completely foreign after 8 years of absence. He found himself tiptoeing around his own home, uncertain of routines that Grace and the children had established, unsure when to insert himself into conversations and activities that had functioned perfectly well without him. His attempts to bond with Emma and James were met with polite but distant responses. When he offered to help Emma with her science project, she thanked him formally but continued working with Grace, who had been guiding her research for weeks. When he suggested taking James to a professional baseball game, the boy looked uncomfortable and asked if Grace could come too, clearly unwilling to spend extended time alone with his father. The business empire that Marcus had built began to suffer from his distraction. Conference calls were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter from other rooms, making him acutely aware of the life happening around him that he wasn't part of. Board meetings felt less important when he knew that James had a piano recital or Emma had a science fair presentation. For the first time in his adult life, work felt like an obligation rather than a passion. Grace maintained her role as the children's primary caregiver, but Marcus could see the strain in her eyes. She was caught between her natural authority with Emma and James and her uncertainty about how much space to give their returning father. She continued to make most of the parenting decisions, from approving sleepovers to monitoring homework, but she always checked with Marcus afterward, a gesture that felt more like courtesy than genuine consultation. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening when Emma fell ill with a fever. Marcus was working late in his home office when he heard voices from upstairs, followed by Grace's footsteps hurrying between Emma's room and the kitchen. He found Grace in the hallway holding a thermometer and looking worried. Emma's temperature had spiked, and Grace was debating whether to call the doctor or wait until morning. Without thinking, Marcus stepped into the situation, offering to drive to the pharmacy for medicine while Grace stayed with Emma. It was the first time he had taken any real parental responsibility since his return, and Grace's relief was visible as she accepted his help. They worked together through the night, taking turns checking Emma's temperature, bringing her water, and sitting beside her bed until the fever broke near dawn. Emma's illness marked a turning point in their household dynamics. For the first time, Marcus had been truly needed, not just as a legal guardian or financial provider, but as another caring adult who could share the burden of worry that comes with parenting. Grace had been carrying that burden alone for years, and the relief of having someone to share it with was evident in her exhausted but grateful smile as they watched Emma sleep peacefully. James had observed the entire situation with interest, seeing his father and Grace work together as a team for the first time. The next morning, he asked Marcus about his business travels, showing genuine curiosity about his father's work for the first time since his return. It was a small opening, but Marcus recognized its significance and answered thoughtfully, trying to explain his work in terms that would interest a 10-year-old. The conversation with James led to others, and gradually both children began including Marcus in more of their daily activities. Emma started asking for his opinion on book choices for her reports, while James invited him to listen to his piano practice sessions. These small gestures of acceptance meant more to Marcus than any business deal he had ever closed, but it was Grace's gradual trust that truly transformed their household. She began consulting him about larger decisions, genuinely seeking his input rather than simply informing him of choices she had already made. When the school counselor wanted to discuss James's potential placement in advanced mathematics classes, Grace suggested that Marcus attend the meeting with her. It was the first time he had been included in an official school function, and the experience of advocating for his son's educational needs alongside Grace felt profoundly meaningful. The most significant change came when Grace started allowing Marcus to take on more substantial parenting responsibilities. She taught him Emma's bedtime routine, showing him how to braid her hair the way she preferred and which stories she liked to hear before sleep. She explained James's practice schedule and helped Marcus understand how to encourage the boy's musical development without applying too much pressure. These lessons in parenting from Grace were humbling experiences for Marcus. He realized how much skill and intuition were required to understand children's individual needs, to know when to be firm and when to be flexible, to provide guidance without stifling independence. Grace had developed these abilities through years of patient observation and trial and error, and she was generous in sharing her knowledge with him. Marcus also began to understand the financial sacrifices Grace had been making for his children. Her modest salary could never have covered the music lessons, sports equipment, educational trips, and countless other expenses that enriched Emma and James's lives. She had been supplementing their opportunities with her own money, sometimes going without things she needed in order to provide experiences that would help them grow and learn. When Marcus discovered receipts for Emma's astronomy camp and James's summer music program, both paid for from Grace's personal savings, he was overwhelmed with gratitude and shame. While he had been accumulating wealth across the globe, Grace had been spending her limited resources to ensure his children had every possible advantage. The depth of her sacrifice and commitment to their well-being was staggering. Marcus insisted on reimbursing Grace for all her past expenses and establishing a separate account for the children's activities and educational needs. But Grace's reaction to his gesture revealed something important about her character. She wasn't interested in being compensated for her sacrifices. She had made them freely out of love. What she valued was his recognition of her role in the children's lives and his commitment to supporting their continued development. The two household began to develop new rhythms that incorporated all three adults as important figures in Emma and James's lives. Marcus took over certain responsibilities that played to his strengths, helping with homework that required research skills, and taking the children on educational outings that broadened their understanding of the world. Grace maintained her role as their emotional anchor and daily caregiver, while also beginning to carve out small amounts of personal time that she hadn't allowed herself in years. One evening, as Marcus sat reading with Emma while Grace helped James with a challenging piano piece, he experienced a moment of profound contentment. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Multiple adults working together to nurture and guide children, each contributing their unique strengths to create a supportive environment for growth and learning. But even as their new family structure began to stabilize, Marcus sensed that Grace was still holding back emotionally. She remained somewhat formal with him, maintaining professional boundaries even as they collaborated more closely in parenting his children. He suspected there were still secrets she was keeping, still parts of her relationship with Emma and James that she hadn't fully revealed to him. The complete truth about their bond was yet to be discovered, and Marcus began to realize that Grace's connection to his children might be even deeper than he had imagined. The revelation that would change everything came on a quiet Sunday morning 3 months after Marcus's return. He was organizing Victoria's remaining personal papers when he discovered a sealed envelope hidden in the back of her jewelry box. His name was written on the front in Victoria's distinctive handwriting, along with instructions that it should only be opened after her death. With trembling hands, Marcus broke the seal and began to read his ex-wife's final letter to him. Victoria's words were filled with regret and shocking confessions that recontextualized everything Marcus thought he knew about his family. She revealed that her decision to keep him away from Emma and James hadn't been born solely from anger about their divorce. There had been a deeper, more complicated reason that she had taken to her grave, a secret that explained Grace's extraordinary devotion to his children. According to Victoria's letter, Grace wasn't just the children's caregiver. She was their biological aunt. Victoria had never told anyone, not even Grace herself, that Grace's younger sister Marie had been Emma and James's birth mother. Marie had died in childbirth, and the twins had been placed for adoption through a private agency that Victoria and Marcus had used when they struggled with infertility. The letter explained that Victoria had recognized Grace's last name when she applied for the housekeeper position, but had chosen to hire her without revealing their connection. Victoria had wanted the children to have some biological family in their lives, even if that person didn't know about their shared blood. She had watched Grace fall in love with Emma and James, had seen their immediate bond, and had realized that fate had brought them together. As the years passed, Victoria had become increasingly dependent on Grace's natural parenting abilities, while struggling with her own maternal instincts. The guilt of keeping the family connection secret had eaten away at her, especially as she watched Grace sacrifice everything for children who were unknowingly her own niece and nephew. Victoria had planned to reveal the truth eventually, but her sudden death had left that burden for Marcus to carry. The letter also contained copies of legal documents that Victoria had kept hidden: Marie's birth certificate, adoption papers, and medical records that proved the family connection beyond any doubt. There were also photographs of Marie that showed her striking resemblance to Grace, and baby pictures of Emma and James that revealed their inherited features from their birth mother's side of the family. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the full implications of Victoria's revelation sank in. Grace's inexplicable devotion to his children suddenly made perfect sense. The maternal instincts that had driven her to sacrifice her own dreams, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward Emma and James, the way they had bonded with her so naturally, it was all explained by their biological connection. But the revelation also raised terrible questions about what he should do with this information. Grace had been loving and caring for her own blood relatives without knowing their true relationship. Emma and James had been raised by their aunt, who had given them the kind of unconditional love that only family could provide. Should he tell Grace the truth? Should he tell the children? Would knowing enhance their relationships or complicate them beyond repair? Marcus spent the next several days wrestling with his decision, watching Grace interact with Emma and James with new understanding. Every gesture of affection, every moment of pride in their achievements, every instance of protective concern took on deeper meaning. Grace wasn't just an exceptional caregiver who had formed unusual bonds with his children. She was their family, connected to them by blood and love in equal measure. The decision about whether to reveal the truth was taken out of Marcus's hands when Emma found him reading Victoria's letter in his study. She was looking for help with a math problem when she noticed the photographs of a woman who looked remarkably like Grace scattered across his desk. With the directness that 10-year-olds possess, Emma asked who the woman in the pictures was and why she looked so much like Grace. Marcus realized he couldn't lie to his daughter, couldn't add more deception to a family that had already been built on too many secrets. He sat Emma down and explained as gently as possible that the woman in the photographs was Grace's sister, who had been her and James's birth mother. He watched Emma's eyes widen with understanding and amazement as she processed the information. Emma's first instinct was to run and tell James, but Marcus stopped her, explaining that this news needed to be shared carefully with everyone at the same time. He called Grace and James into the study, his heart pounding as he prepared to reveal the truth that would forever change their family dynamic. Grace's reaction to the news was a mixture of shock, joy, and overwhelming emotion that she struggled to contain. Everything about her connection to the children suddenly made sense. The instant bond she had felt, the protective instincts that had driven her decisions, the way they had seemed to understand each other without words. The children she had loved as her own were truly her family, connected to her through her beloved sister who had died bringing them into the world. James and Emma were fascinated by the revelation, asking endless questions about their birth mother and marveling at their genetic connection to Grace. The news explained so many things they had wondered about: their musical abilities that mirrored Grace's talents, their shared love of reading and learning, their similar temperaments and ways of viewing the world. But perhaps the most profound change was in Grace herself. The knowledge that Emma and James were her sister's children, her own flesh and blood, lifted a weight from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For years she had felt guilty about loving them so completely, wondering if her devotion was appropriate or healthy. Now she understood that her feelings were natural, that the bond she felt with them was rooted in family connection as well as years of shared experience. Marcus watched as his household transformed once again, this time into something that felt truly complete. Grace was no longer just the caregiver who had stepped into a parental role. She was family in the truest sense, with every right to love Emma and James as her own. The children now had a father who was learning to be present and engaged, and an aunt who had been their devoted guardian angel from the beginning. As he observed Grace tucking Emma and James into bed that night, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude for the woman who had saved his family in ways he was only beginning to understand. She had given his children the love and stability they needed, had preserved their capacity for trust and affection despite his absence, and had created a home where they could all learn to be a family together. The billionaire who had thought he was returning to reclaim his children had instead discovered that the most valuable thing in his life had been safely guarded by the woman who loved them most.